The sound of a man ordering his usual can tell you everything about whether he plans to live through the night. Nora Bellamy had learned that in 4 years of working the private dining floor at the Alderton, Chicago's quietest and most expensive secret. Not the restaurant on the ground floor, with its Michelin stars and its waiting list and its tourists pretending they belonged. The floor above it, the one without a sign, without a menu, without a single photograph on any travel blog in existence. The one where the linen was changed between every course and the wine was never discussed by price. She had been invisible on that floor since the night she was hired, not because management told her to be, though they had in so many words, but because she understood early that invisibility was its own kind of armor. She was 29 years old, 5'4", and wore her size 16 body with the quiet resignation of someone who had long ago stopped expecting the room to look at her. She moved between tables like furniture moved, like weather moved, like something everyone acknowledged existed but no one actually saw. It was a skill she had sharpened for years without knowing what she was sharpening it for. Until the 3rd Tuesday of November, when she brought a glass of Pappy Van Winkle 23-year to table 9 and heard, from 4 feet away and through the ambient noise of a room full of powerful men pretending to eat dinner, the word ambush. The man at table 9 was named Dorian Voss. She knew that the way she knew most things on this floor, not because anyone told her, but because she paid attention. She'd seen the name once, in a reservation ledger she was never supposed to glance at, and she had cross-referenced it without meaning to against the quiet terror that fell over the kitchen whenever his car pulled into the alley below. The sous chef stopped swearing. The floor manager straightened his tie twice. The sommelier pulled the pappy from the locked cabinet, the one that was not on the list he handed to everyone else. Dorian Voss was 41 years old. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. Jaw too sharp, eyes too steady, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace but its opposite. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Nora made in 3 months, and he wore it the way men wear things when clothes are just another way of communicating that you should be afraid of them. He came to the Alderton every 3rd Tuesday, always table 9, always alone. Always the pappy before dinner, always the same order. The dry-aged ribeye, medium rare, no sides. And always gone before 10 o'clock. Nora had served him 11 times. He had never once looked at her. She was setting the glass down 2 inches from the edge of the table the way he liked it without ever having said so when she heard it. She had remarkable hearing. It was another thing she'd never thought to call a skill until right now. Floors too exposed, the man across from Voss was saying. His name she didn't know. He had a wide face and a neck like a fire hydrant and a way of sitting that suggested he was accustomed to taking up other people's space. He was leaning in, voice dropped below the ambient noise of the room, but not quite far enough. Rise already has 3 of his people in position. By the time you leave, it'll be 6. They're not here for the food. Voss said nothing. He had the particular stillness of a man cataloguing information.
We've got maybe 40 minutes before the window closes,
the wide-faced man continued.
Colton says they've been watching the car since 9.
Nora straightened. She moved 2 steps toward the service alcove and then she stopped. The man who had just been described as walking into an ambush in 40 minutes had not looked up once. He was reading something on his phone, face neutral, one hand resting loosely on the table. He looked like a man at no particular crossroads. He looked like a man waiting for his ribeye. She looked around the floor, 4 other tables all occupied, all in their own worlds. The floor manager was near the host station with his back turned. The second server, Piers, was deep in conversation with a 4-top near the window. Nora went back to the kitchen. She stood at the prep counter for 11 seconds. She counted because that was the kind of person she was. The counting kind, the noticing kind, the kind who tallied things that other people let slide past them unexamined. 4 years of college for an accounting degree she was using to balance the tip distributions every Saturday morning, because the actual accounting job she'd wanted had gone to someone else, and then someone else. And eventually she had stopped applying and started taking shifts here, because at least the money was consistent, and no one expected her to take up space she hadn't been assigned. She pulled a cocktail napkin from the stack near the espresso machine. She took the pen from her apron pocket. She wrote in block letters, small and deliberate. The way you write something you want to be readable under pressure. They're not here for the food. I heard everything. 6 of them outside. Leave through the kitchen now. She folded the napkin once. She walked back out to the floor. Her pulse was doing something she didn't have a name for. Not quite fear and not quite the absence of it. Something in between that felt like standing at the edge of a very high place and choosing to step off anyway. The rational part of her brain, the part that had kept her employed and unremarkable for 4 years, was compiling a list of everything wrong with what she was about to do. The list was long. The list had subheadings. She ignored it. She came to table 9 with the water pitcher she'd picked up on the way, because she needed a reason to be there, and she refilled Dorian Voss's water glass with the same unhurried quiet she always used, and she set the folded napkin beside his hand without looking at it, and without looking at him, and without pausing or hesitating, or in any way suggesting that something significant had just occurred. She walked back to the service alcove. She stood there and she breathed, and she waited for whatever happened next. What happened next was nothing, for exactly 4 minutes. She knew because she was watching the clock on the wall above the service stations, the one shaped like a sunburst that had been there since the 1970s and had never been updated because it had come with the building, and the owner believed in continuity. 4 minutes of table 9 looking exactly the same as it always looked. Voss still with his phone, the wide-faced man now eating his bread. Then Voss looked up. He did not look at the floor manager. He did not look at the wide-faced man across from him, who was still talking about something Nora could no longer hear from this distance. He looked directly at the service alcove. He looked at her. She felt it like a physical thing, like stepping into a beam of light after a long time in the dark, except the light in question had teeth. His expression did not change. His eyes, dark, very dark, the kind of dark that absorbs rather than reflects, held hers for a moment that was probably 3 seconds and felt like considerably longer. Then he looked back down at his phone. 2 minutes later he stood up, said something brief to the wide-faced man that made the man go still, and attentive the way people go still when someone they respect gives them a clear instruction. Voss buttoned his jacket. He picked up his phone and slid it into his pocket. He walked toward the service alcove. Nora stopped breathing. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and woodsy that cost more than her rent. And she became suddenly, acutely aware of the fact that she had no plan beyond the napkin. She had not thought about this part. She had thought about the napkin. He said, very quietly, "How long have you worked this floor?" She said, 4 years, and in 4 years, he said, "How many times have you involved yourself in something that wasn't your business?" She held his gaze because looking away felt like losing something. Once, something moved through his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the recognition of an unexpected variable. He looked at her the way she imagined engineers looked at bridges that held more weight than calculated. "The kitchen exit," he said. "Left past the prep station," she said. "There's a loading door at the end of the hall. The alley connects to Westmore Street." He looked at her for another moment. Then he walked through the service door. She thought that was the end of it. She thought she would spend the rest of the shift trying to explain to Piers why she was unusually quiet, and then go home to her apartment in Pilsen and make tea and go to bed and probably not sleep, and in the morning decide whether she had done something extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily stupid, the two being, in her experience, difficult to distinguish. The wide-faced man left 12 minutes later, looking unsettled in a way that powerful men usually did not allow themselves to look in public. The floor manager gave her a curious look when she went to close out table 9. She said nothing. She cleared the glasses. She changed the linen. She went home. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a mug of chamomile at 11:15 when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. Chicago area code. She stared at it for 2 rings. She answered. "You didn't ask me why," said a voice she recognized. "And you didn't ask me what to do. You just handled it." A pause. "Most people can't do that," she said. "Most people on that floor aren't paying attention. And you were." "I'm always paying attention," Nora said. "There isn't much else to do when no one knows you're there." There was a silence on the other end of the line, not an uncomfortable silence, the kind that meant something was being considered carefully. "My name is Dorian Voss," he said, as though she didn't already know, as though he was choosing to introduce himself, which was different. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "What's your name?" she told him. "Nora Bellamy," he repeated, and she had never heard her own name sound like that before. Deliberate, like something being filed somewhere important. "I need someone to run the books for a private hospitality group." The position has been open for 3 weeks. The interview process is apparently insufficient. She said nothing for a moment. The Alderton's private floor, she said slowly. Isn't actually owned by the Alderton, is it? Another pause. Longer this time, he said, and the hospitality group, she said, is private, he said, in the way that matters. She looked around her kitchen. At the accounting textbooks she kept on the shelf more out of stubbornness than utility. At the tea cooling in her mug. At the 3 years of job applications she'd filed in a folder on her laptop under a name she'd made herself stop opening. What are the hours? She said. She started on a Monday. The offices were in a building in River North that looked like an architecture firm from the outside and felt like one on the inside too. Clean lines, expensive restraint. The kind of quiet that came from very good soundproofing and the implicit understanding that noise was a form of weakness. She was given a desk, a laptop, a key card, and an introduction to a man named Fletcher Oakes, who was Voss's head of operations, and who looked at her the way people looked at weather they weren't sure how to dress for. "You're the accountant," he said. "I'm the accountant," she said. He seemed to be waiting for her to say something else. She didn't. She sat down, opened the laptop, and got to work. The books, when she got into them, were a landscape of deliberate obfuscation. Shell companies nested inside holding groups, nested inside trusts. All of it technically legal the way a house built over a fault line is technically a house. She understood immediately what she was looking at. She also understood that her predecessor, whoever had held this job before the position became open, had either not understood it or had chosen not to look too closely. Nora looked closely. By the end of the 2nd week, she had found 3 discrepancies. By the end of the 3rd week, she had found a pattern. She sat with the pattern for 4 days, mapping it backward through 18 months of records before she brought it to Fletcher Oakes. He went very still when she laid the printout on his desk. She watched his face in the way she'd learned to watch faces on the private floor, not for what they showed, but for what they suppressed. He picked up his phone. 20 minutes later, Dorian Voss was standing in the doorway of her office. He looked the same as he always looked. The same controlled stillness. The same eyes that took in a room the way a scan took in an X-ray, measuring everything at once. But there was something different about the way he was looking at her. The engineer looking at the bridge expression, except now the bridge had apparently done something the engineer hadn't expected. "Walk me through it," he said. She did. She used the printout, and then she used the second printout, and then she pulled up the spreadsheet on her laptop and turned it toward him and walked him through 18 months of money, moving in directions that suggested someone inside his organization was running a secondary account structure parallel to his own. Someone he trusted. "How long?" he said. "The first transfer I can confirm was 14 months ago," she said. "But the groundwork, the account structure, was built over the 6 months before that. Whoever did this planned it carefully." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What would have happened if you hadn't found it?" She considered the question. Another 6 months, maybe 8. Then the parallel structure would have been large enough to support an independent operation. At that point, whoever built it wouldn't need you anymore. The room was very quiet. She could hear the soundproofing. "You understand," he said. "Not quite a question what it means, that you found this." "I understand," she said. "That it means someone who works closely with you is building an exit, or building an attack," he said quietly. He left her office without another word. 3 days passed without incident. Nora kept her head down and her hours long, and told herself that she was simply an accountant who had done her job correctly, and that whatever happened next was not her problem. She had found the pattern. She had reported it. She had fulfilled the terms of her employment. She almost believed it. On the 4th day, Fletcher Oakes came to her office at 7:15 in the morning, before anyone else had arrived, and sat down across from her desk with an expression she recognized from her years on the private floor. The expression of a man who was doing calculations. "You're very good at what you do," he said. "Thank you," she said carefully. "I mean that as a straightforward observation," he said. "Not as a compliment. Compliments are something else." He paused. "How much did you find?" She looked at him. "I gave Voss everything I found." "I know what you gave Voss," he said. "I'm asking if there's more." She held his gaze. "Why would there be more?" "Because you're the kind of person," he said, with something that might have been respect if it hadn't been threaded with something else, who finds everything. Not just what she's looking for, everything. He leaned forward slightly. And I'm asking because the people who built that account structure are going to want to know how much you know before they decide what to do about you. The room felt smaller suddenly. You're not warning me, she said. No, he said. You're negotiating, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That's very perceptive. I'm always perceptive, she said. You said so yourself. She kept her hands flat on the desk. She kept her voice level. You helped them build it. He didn't answer. Not the account structure, she said. You're not an accountant, but the access, the time they needed, the questions you didn't ask. She studied him. You have a brother. In debt. It would be to someone who could make that problem disappear if you cooperated, or become considerably worse if you didn't. The silence stretched. They said they just needed a few months, he said finally, and his voice had changed, flattened in the way voices flattened when someone stopped performing. They weren't going to hurt anyone, just secure enough to walk away. Walk away from Voss, she said. Walk away cleanly, he said. There's a difference. Not to him, she said. She picked up her phone from the desk. Fletcher stood up. I wouldn't. You told me, she said, that you weren't warning me, so I'm not warning you either. She typed a single message, 2 lines. She sent it. I found more this morning, she said. I found it 3 days ago, actually. I've been waiting to understand the rest of it. His face went through several things in quick succession. What did you send him? He said. The second layer, she said, and your brother's name, and the name of the organization your brother borrowed from. She set the phone down. Because that's also in the accounts, Fletcher. Buried, but there. Someone wasn't as careful as they thought. He left without another word. She was still at her desk 40 minutes later when the door to her office opened, and Dorian Voss walked in and closed the door behind him and stood there looking at her with an expression she had no previous reference point for. Not the calculating stillness, something below that. Something more like the face a man made when he understood, completely and without ambiguity, that someone had chosen his side when they had no particular obligation to. He sat down across from her in the chair Fletcher Oakes had occupied. My assistant of 8 years, he said, is apparently also an investor in my problems. The phrasing was dry. She understood it was the closest he came to expressing something that cost him. He was scared, she said. That doesn't make him less culpable. But it explains the judgment. He looked at her. You're defending him? I'm contextualizing him, she said. There's a difference. Something shifted in his face. Something that in another man's face she might have called the beginning of a smile, not the arrival of one, just the conditions under which one might form. Why did you send me the second file, he said. You'd already reported what I asked you to find. You were in the clear. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the cocktail napkin and the kitchen exit, and 4 years of being so thoroughly invisible that she'd started to believe the invisibility was just the natural condition of her existence. She thought about the moment he'd looked at her across the floor of the Alderton, and she had understood, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone was actually seeing her. You didn't snap your fingers at me, she said. He looked at her. In 11 times of serving your table, she said. You never snapped your fingers or raised your hand or waved me over. When you wanted something, you waited. You acknowledged that I'd arrive when I'd arrive. She paused. On that floor, that's uncommon. Most men at that table treat the servers the way they treat furniture. I don't treat furniture that way either, he said. I know, she said. That's the point. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very carefully, as though he were choosing each word the way you chose tools for a specific job. I've been doing what I do for 16 years. In that time, I have been careful about who I trust. I have been incorrect about who I trust several times. I have learned from it. He paused. I have not trusted someone's instincts before thinking about it for a considerable amount of time. Okay, she said. I'm telling you this, he said, because I want to be transparent about the fact that what I'm about to say is not something I say lightly. She waited. Stay, he said. Not just the books. I want you in the room when it matters. I want someone who finds everything, not just what they're looking for. She looked at him. That's a more significant offer than an accounting job. Yes, he said, it is. She thought about the size 16 body that had moved invisibly through expensive rooms for 4 years. She thought about the way she'd trained herself to take up less space, make less noise, want less visibility. She thought about what it had taken to fold that napkin and walk back to table 9 and set it beside his hand. She thought about how easy it would have been not to. The second layer of accounts, she said. There's a third. I didn't include it in the message because I needed to understand it first. She turned her laptop to face him. I've been working on it for the last 40 minutes. Someone above Fletcher was coordinating. Not inside the organization, outside. He leaned forward. She walked him through it. An hour later, they were still at her desk. The city outside her window had shifted from early morning to full light. Somewhere in the building, other people had arrived and begun their days. She could hear the sounds of a functional organization. Phones, footsteps, the particular rhythm of people who had work to do. At some point, he had moved from the chair across from her desk to the chair beside it, because the laptop was easier to see from that angle. And she had not noticed the transition as anything other than practical. She noticed it now. He was 6 inches away, and he was looking at the screen with the focused attention he applied to everything, and she was looking at the line of his jaw and the way his hands rested on his knees, and thinking that proximity was a strange thing, that you could know a person existed in the world for years, could have handed them a glass of whiskey 11 times, and still have no real sense of what it meant for them to actually be there, present and specific, in the same small room with you. He turned to say something about the screen and found her looking at him and paused. She didn't look away. "You found the third layer," he said. "I find everything," she said. "You heard." He looked at her for a moment that felt like the moment before a decision rather than after one. "Yes," he said. "I did." 6 months later, Chicago had rearranged itself in the ways that Chicago rearranged itself when the architecture beneath its visible structures shifted. People inside the organization who had built parallel exits were gone. People outside the organization who had funded those exits were gone in other, quieter ways. The third layer of accounts Nora had found in the 40 minutes before Voss arrived at her office had unraveled a threat he hadn't known existed, from a direction he hadn't thought to watch. He had watched it once she showed him where to look. She was still in the same office, though the desk was larger and the window was better, and Fletcher Oakes's name had been removed from the door down the hall and replaced with hers. She still worked long hours, still found everything she was looking for, and several things she wasn't, still kept a second printout for the things she wasn't ready to say aloud until she understood them completely. Some things were different. On Tuesday evenings, when Voss had no particular obligations that qualified as immovable, he had developed the habit of appearing in her office doorway at around 7:30 and asking whether she'd eaten. The question was always phrased as a question, which she'd noticed, because he was entirely capable of phrasing things as directives when the situation warranted it. He didn't phrase this one as a directive. She had also developed the habit of answering honestly, which was usually no. They would go somewhere, never the Alderton, a deliberate choice on both their parts that neither of them had discussed. And she would sit across from him at tables where no one took photographs and no one raised an eyebrow, and he would ask her what she'd found that week and she would tell him. And they would talk about it, the way two people talked about things. They were both genuinely interested in, which was something she had not had enough of in her life, and which she suspected was equally true for him. He had not stopped looking at her the way he'd first looked at her that night. That engineer's look, recalibrated. He had simply extended it, given it more room to be whatever it was. She understood, in the gradual way she understood most significant things, that she was not invisible to him. She was, in fact, the opposite. She was the person in the room he was always aware of, the person whose presence he had restructured his Tuesday evenings around, the person whose found everythings had, on 2 separate occasions since November, kept him alive. He had told her as much, in his precise and unornamented way, over dinner on a Wednesday in March, when the restaurant had been mostly empty, and the conversation had arrived somewhere neither of them had planned for it to go. "I don't know how to do this correctly," he'd said. "I've been told I'm not built for it." "Do what?" she'd said, though she'd known. "This," he'd said. He'd looked at the table, then at her. He was not a man who looked at tables, whatever this is. She'd thought about the napkin, the kitchen exit, the third layer. She'd thought about the specific quality of being seen by someone who looked at the whole world with equal precision, but had somehow chosen inexplicably to look at her most of all. "I don't need you to do it correctly," she said. "I need you to do it honestly." He'd been quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "I can do." She'd believed him. She was the kind of person who found everything, and what she found in him, underneath the stillness and the precision and the years of careful self-containment, was a man who had learned to trust very few people, and had, for reasons she understood better than he probably expected, decided to trust her. She had decided to trust him back. The invisible woman who had carried other people's drinks through expensive rooms for 4 years and learned to shrink herself into the corners had not disappeared. She had simply found, for the first time in a long time, a room in which she didn't need to. She took up exactly as much space as she was, and for the first time in longer than she could count, that was exactly enough.